I still remember the first time I stepped into that house. The rain had just begun to fall, tapping lightly against the windows, and the air inside was heavy, like it had been holding its breath for years. Everything seemed still, too still. Before I go deeper into the story, welcome, and make sure to subscribe to the channel, Echoes of Nightmares, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on any of the future scary tales. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button too. Also, leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from in the world. Now, back to my story. The realtor smiled and called it charming, a classic countryside home with more than enough space for my family. But as I walked through the hallways, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. The house had a certain character, a presence that was hard to explain. Each creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet sounded louder than it should have, echoing in a way that didn't quite make sense. In the living room, the rain grew louder, almost as though it was falling inside the house. I thought it was just my nerves. I wanted this place to be perfect. But there was one moment I can't forget. As I stood in the hallway, staring at the staircase that led to the second floor, I thought I saw a figure at the top. A faint outline just for a split second. I blinked and it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the shadows playing games in an old house. I didn't mention it to my wife, Emily, or my son, Ethan. After all, we had spent months looking for a place like this, and it felt like the fresh start we desperately needed. But there's something about old houses. They carry stories, memories, and sometimes secrets. As the rain continued to fall outside, I could feel the walls of the house almost leaning in, as if they had something to say, but no voice to speak. This was supposed to be our dream home, but the longer we stayed, the more it felt like we didn't belong. And then the whispers began. Tonight, I'm going to share the story of what happened in that house. I wish I could say I imagined it all, but the truth is, I still hear the whispers in my dreams. We moved into the house on a cloudy afternoon in late autumn. The leaves had already fallen, leaving the towering oak trees around the property looking skeletal, their branches twisting toward the gray sky. My wife, Emily, and I had spent weeks convincing ourselves that this was the fresh start we needed. A quiet place in the countryside where Ethan, our 6-year-old son, could grow up far away from the noise of the city. The house wasn't perfect. It was old, very old. The kind of house where the floors groan under your weight and the windows never quite close all the way. But it had charm. It sat on a small hill, surrounded by fields that stretched out toward a dense forest in the distance. The previous owners had left behind some furniture, heavy wooden chairs, a grandfather clock that had long since stopped ticking, and an antique mirror hanging in the hallway. Emily loved it immediately. She saw potential in every cracked wall and peeling piece of wallpaper. Ethan was less sure. He clung to her hand as we explored the rooms, his little eyes darting toward dark corners and shadowed doorways. I chalked it up to the strangeness of being in a new place. But in hindsight, I should have listened to him. We spent the first day unpacking, trying to make the place feel like home. I was setting up the living room when Emily called out to me from upstairs. Her voice sounded strange, excited, but with an edge of uncertainty. "I found something," she said when I reached the attic. She was standing in the center of the room, holding an old leather-bound journal. Dust coated the cover, and the pages were yellowed with age. I asked her what it was, but she just shook her head and said, "I haven't opened it yet." She placed it on a small table near a cracked window and left it there. We didn't touch it again that night. The first sign that something was off came that evening. We had just finished dinner when there was a knock at the door. It was unexpected. Our closest neighbors lived a mile down the road. When I opened the door, I found an older man standing on the porch. He introduced himself as Mr. Grayson, our neighbor. His face was weathered, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the brim of his hat. "I just wanted to welcome you folks to the area," he said, though his eyes kept shifting toward the house behind me. He hesitated before adding, You might hear some things at night. This old place, well, it's got its history." When I pressed him to explain, he just shook his head and muttered, "You'll see. You'll see." It didn't sit well with me, but I didn't want to scare Emily or Ethan, so I let it go. That night, the storm rolled in. The rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks in the old walls. I was lying in bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling, when I heard it, a faint creak coming from the hallway. At first I thought it was Emily, but when I turned over, I saw her fast asleep beside me. The sound came again, louder this time. It was the distinct sound of footsteps on the wooden floor, slow and deliberate. I got up and opened the bedroom door, peering into the dark hallway. Nothing, just the dim light from the old chandelier swaying gently, as if moved by an unseen breeze. I told myself it was the wind and went back to bed, but as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been standing there, just out of sight, watching me. In the morning, I tried to forget about it. Emily and Ethan seemed happy, and I didn't want to ruin the mood. But as the day went on, little things began to pile up. Emily told me she heard someone humming while she was in the kitchen, but when she checked, no one was there. Ethan refused to go into his bedroom, saying, "The lady doesn't want me in there." I laughed it off, trying to ease the tension. "What lady?" I asked, but Ethan just shrugged and said, "The one in the corner." That night, as the rain continued to fall, Emily went back to the attic to get the journal. I remember the look on her face when she came downstairs. It was pale, her eyes wide. She handed me the open book and said, "You need to see this." The pages were filled with handwriting, uneven and jagged, like it had been written in a hurry. The words didn't make sense, half-finished sentences and strange symbols scattered across the margins. But one phrase was repeated over and over, written in large, bold letters across multiple pages. "She's still here." The first full day in the house felt uneasy. It wasn't one specific thing, but a series of small moments that didn't quite add up. Emily was the first to notice. She had been unpacking boxes in the living room when she heard faint footsteps upstairs. At first, she thought it was Ethan, but when she called out to him, he appeared in the doorway, holding one of his toy cars. "I thought you were upstairs," she said. "I wasn't," he replied matter-of-factly before returning to his toys. Emily went upstairs to check, but the hallways were empty, and the doors were all closed. Still, she swore she felt a draft, as if someone had just walked by. That evening, as we were settling in for dinner, Ethan mentioned her for the first time. "The nice lady said I can keep my toys in her room," he said casually, picking at his food. Emily and I exchanged glances. "What lady?" I asked. "The one in my room." She said it's okay. I tried to laugh it off. "Must be an imaginary friend," I said. But Ethan just shrugged and went back to eating. Emily didn't seem so sure. That night, the house seemed to come alive. Doors that we had closed earlier were slightly ajar. The chandelier in the hallway swayed gently, though there was no breeze. Around midnight, Emily nudged me awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. At first I didn't, but then faintly I caught it, the sound of someone humming. It was soft and distant, almost like a lullaby. I got up to check the house, armed with nothing but a flashlight. As I walked through the darkened hallways, the sound seemed to follow me, always staying just out of reach. I searched every room, but found nothing. When I returned to the bedroom, Emily was sitting up in bed, holding the journal. She looked pale, her hands trembling slightly. "I read it," she said. The entries were fragmented, disjointed, but one phrase stood out, repeated over and over, "The watcher in the walls." I asked her what it meant, but she didn't answer. Instead, she closed the journal and said, "We shouldn't have come here." The next morning, Emily was determined to figure out what was happening. While Ethan played outside, She and I sat at the kitchen table, poring over the journal and searching online for any mention of the house's history. What we found was chilling. The house had been built in the early 1900s by a family that vanished under mysterious circumstances. Over the decades, it changed hands several times, but the pattern was always the same. The owners would leave suddenly, abandoning the house and everything inside. In the 1980s, the house had been purchased by a couple, the Wilkins family. According to old newspaper articles, they had disappeared without a trace after only a year of living there. Their belongings were left untouched, and no one had seen them again. As we dug deeper, we found an even darker story. Local legends spoke of a woman who had lived in the house in the 1940s, a recluse who was rumored to practice occult rituals. Neighbors claimed to have seen strange lights in the windows late at night and heard chanting carried on the wind. Emily was shaken. "What if she's still here?" she asked. That afternoon, Ethan came to us with a piece of paper clutched in his tiny hands. "I drew her," he said proudly. The drawing was simple, the way a child might sketch, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. The figure he'd drawn was tall and thin, with a completely blank face and long, dark hair. "That's the lady in my room," he explained. I felt a chill run down my spine. Emily and I exchanged a look but said nothing. We didn't want to scare him. That night, the whispers returned. They weren't faint anymore. They were clear, distinct, and insistent. Over and over, we heard the same words. "You can't leave now." Emily couldn't sleep. She went back to the attic to see if the journal held any answers. That's when she found it, the trapdoor. It was hidden beneath an old rug in the corner of the attic. The wood was warped, and it took all her strength to pry it open. Beneath it was a narrow set of stairs leading down into darkness. I found her standing there, staring into the abyss. "I think I need to go down," she whispered. I wanted to stop her, but something about the look in her eyes told me it wouldn't matter. She was drawn to it. We descended the stairs together, flashlight beams cutting through the pitch-black darkness. The air grew colder the deeper we went, and the smell, damp, moldy, and faintly metallic, was overwhelming. At the bottom, we found a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in faded photographs. Most were too decayed to make out, but a few were eerily clear. Pictures of people standing in the very same house. The last photo we found was the most disturbing. It showed a woman standing in the attic, her face hidden by shadows. But there was something behind her, a figure, barely visible, staring directly at the camera. Emily turned to me, her voice barely a whisper. "That's her. That's the watcher." The storm that night was unlike anything we had experienced since moving in. The wind rattled the windows, and the rain pounded against the roof like relentless drumming. We had barely settled into bed when it started. The banging. It sounded like someone was slamming their fists against the walls, moving from one part of the house to another. Emily and I shot out of bed, adrenaline coursing through us. "I'll check it out," I said, grabbing the flashlight. Emily stayed with Ethan in his room, clutching him tightly as he buried his face against her shoulder. I made my way toward the basement, where the noise seemed the loudest. Each step down the creaking staircase felt heavier, the darkness below almost suffocating. The banging grew louder as I reached the bottom. I swept the flashlight around the basement, its beam bouncing off dusty shelves and cobweb corners. And then, as if on cue, the basement door slammed shut behind me. I raced up the stairs and pounded on the door. "Emily, Emily, I'm locked in." But the only response was the sound of muffled whispers, like a chorus of voices just beyond the wood. Then I heard her scream. Emily's voice pierced through the storm, and I felt a wave of panic crash over me. I threw myself against the door, the old wood groaning under the pressure. Finally, it gave way, and I stumbled into the hallway. The house was different now. The air was heavy, the shadows seemed deeper, and the whispers were everywhere. I ran to Ethan's room, calling out their names. When I reached the doorway, my heart froze. Emily was standing in the corner, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She didn't respond when I called her name. She was staring at something. And then I saw it. The figure Ethan had been drawing, the one with no face, was standing in the opposite corner of the room, its head tilted slightly as if observing Emily, its form impossibly tall and dark. I grabbed her arm and pulled her away. "We have to go," I shouted. But as we ran down the hallway, Ethan wasn't behind us. We turned back, frantic, searching every room. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until they formed a single phrase. "You can't leave now." Finally, we found him in the attic, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the hidden room. The journal was open in front of him, and he was staring blankly at the wall, his eyes glazed over. "Ethan," Emily cried, rushing to him, but he didn't react. He just kept muttering the same phrase over and over, "She's." Trapped in the attic with no way out, we knew there was no use running anymore. Emily picked up the journal, flipping through the pages desperately. "There has to be something in here," she whispered, her voice trembling. That's when we saw it. A page we hadn't noticed before, written in bold, jagged letters. "You cannot leave until the Watcher is appeased. To try is to die." Emily's hands shook as she read aloud. "The Watcher isn't just a spirit. She bound herself to the house, feeding on the souls of those who enter. If she isn't satisfied, she won't let us go." Suddenly, Ethan turned his head sharply, his eyes locking onto Emily's. "She wants you," he said, his voice monotone. "What?" Emily whispered, her face going pale. "She said it has to be you." Ethan continued, his voice eerily calm. "Or we all stay." In the corner of the room, the shadowy figure began to materialize fully. It moved closer, its faceless head tilting toward Emily. I stood in front of her, shielding her from the entity, but I could feel it. Its presence was suffocating. Emily gripped my arm and whispered, "We can't fight it." She held up the journal, pointing to a section scrawled in chaotic handwriting. "One must offer themselves willingly to break the curse. Only then can the Watcher rest." I refused to let her go, but the house wouldn't wait. The walls began to tremble, the floor beneath us creaked dangerously, and the figure reached out, its shadowy hand extending toward Ethan. Emily stepped forward. "Take me," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. The figure paused, its head turning toward her slowly. Then, without warning, the room went completely dark. In the pitch-black attic, Emily fumbled with the journal, her trembling hands barely able to hold on to it. The flickering beam of my flashlight cast erratic shadows across the walls, which seemed to pulse and breathe, as if the house itself were alive. "There's a ritual," Emily whispered, her voice strained. I moved closer to her, trying to steady her hands as she flipped through the pages. The instructions were scrawled in messy, desperate handwriting, barely legible. "To appease the Watcher, you must offer what it desires most, a piece of your soul." The words hung heavy in the air. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no other way. The house wasn't going to let us leave, not without her. Emily gathered what she needed for the ritual, her movements quick and precise despite the fear in her eyes. A candle, matches, a strand of her hair, and a small knife, all things mentioned in the journal. She knelt in the center of the attic, drawing the symbols as described in the book. The lines were crooked, hurried, but complete. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. "No," I protested, grabbing her arm. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way," she replied, tears welling in her eyes. "If I don't, it'll take Ethan." I had no choice but to step back, my heart pounding as she lit the candle and began reciting the words from the journal. The room grew colder with every word she spoke. The shadows in the corners of the attic thickened, creeping closer, like black tendrils reaching out for her. The house began to shake violently, the beams groaning as if under immense pressure. The air was thick, electric, almost impossible to breathe. The candle flickered, nearly going out, as the shadowy figure emerged once again, this time fully formed. It was taller than the ceiling should have allowed, its faceless head tilting toward Emily. It screamed, a sound so guttural and piercing that I instinctively covered my ears. Emily didn't falter. She took the knife, cutting a shallow line across her palm, letting a few drops of blood drip onto the symbol she'd drawn. "Take it," she shouted, her voice breaking. "Take what you want and let us go." The shadow lunged toward her, enveloping her in darkness. For a moment, I thought I'd lost her. But then the light from the candle flared, burning brighter than it should have, illuminating the entire attic. The figure recoiled, letting out another unearthly scream. The walls of the attic rippled like water, and the storm outside reached its crescendo. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. When the light faded, the shadowy figure was still there, but it was no longer solid. It flickered, its form unstable, like smoke dissipating in the air. It let out one last, agonized wail, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Then, with a final burst of light, it vanished completely. Emily collapsed to the floor, her face pale, her breathing shallow. I rushed to her side, holding her close as tears streamed down both our faces. "It's over," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's finally over." We spent the rest of the night in silence, huddled together in the living room. None of us dared to sleep, too afraid that the figure might return. As the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, we gathered what little we could carry and left the house without looking back. Ethan seemed different, quieter, more subdued. When I asked him if he was okay, he simply nodded, but his eyes were distant, as if he'd seen something he couldn't explain. Emily looked at me as we loaded into the car. "We can never come back," she said. I nodded. She didn't have to tell me twice. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw something in the attic window, a dark figure watching us go. But when I looked again, it was gone. To this day, the house remains abandoned, a silent reminder of what we endured. Some nights, when the rain falls just right, I swear I can still hear the whispers. "You can't leave now." After that night, we never returned to the house. We left it behind, along with everything we couldn't carry in our hurried escape. For weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us, even in our new home. The house has remained empty ever since, shrouded in silence and mystery. Some locals say they still see faint lights flickering in the attic at night. Others claim to hear whispers in the rain when they pass by. Was it truly haunted? Or were we just victims of our own fears, our imaginations running wild in a creaky old house with a dark past? Even now, I'm not sure what to believe. But one thing is certain, whatever was in that house, it didn't want us to leave. And it almost succeeded. What do you think really happened in that house? Was it haunted? Or was it all in our heads? Let us know your theories in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. If this story gave you chills, hit the like button to let us know. And don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying tales. You never know what might be waiting for you next.